Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present the Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome back to the Formed Book Club. This week we are going to begin discussing Russell Shaw's book, 8 Popes and the Crisis of Modernity. And we just finished with several sessions on Father McTague's book on real philosophy for real people. And that was very philosophical and required a lot of in-depth discussion of particular texts with a lot of citations. This, I think, is a broader view of the 20th century, looking at it from the point of view of the popes who were in succession during that century and how they addressed the crisis of modernity. So I think this is one we can have a more general discussion about it. I don't think we'll have to be doing as many citations, but maybe I'll be wrong. We'll see. It's interesting. Father McTague talked about the importance of taking modernity into account when doing, ethical evaluations, that there is something which was a positive that came after the Enlightenment, and also, different theories that came after the Enlightenment. We have to analyze. But here, I think Russell Shaw is talking about the crisis aspect of modernity, not the positive contributions, but the problems which it caused. So, and in the introduction, which I found very, very fine, he really talks about 3 figures that sort of are the main protagonists in modernity, ending modernity: Marx, Freud, and who's the third?
Darwin.
Darwin, he's the first. And in all 3 of those, we have a reduction of the world in a material world run by libido, where there's no transcendence. Those are the kind of the characteristics of post-modernity. But it seems to me like it's almost an unavoidable consequence of Enlightenment principles carried through to their conclusion. I'll stop there for the moment.
Well, I mean, again, I also was very struck by the scene that Russell Shaw was setting, right at the beginning with his discussion about whether we're living in a modernist era or a post-modernist era. And I'm pleased that he does actually have a footnote saying that it doesn't really matter how we label it. Charles Taylor says that basically postmodernism is just part of modernism, whereas who was it that said it?
Taylor.
Guardini.
Charles Taylor.
I think Charles Taylor says that they're the same, and I think it's Guardini that says that they're different.
Oh, okay.
But for me, this is a civil war between within modernism. Postmodernism. For me, what defines modernism is a belief that we're moving forward to a better age because modernity is always better than the past, and therefore the future will always be better than the present. And I think you get that implicit even in postmodernity. There's still this idea of transhumanism. That's a postmodern thing where we can reinvent ourselves. Nietzsche, if you like, as he's the other person's figure that's mentioned here, Nietzsche, and I think it should be 4 people, not just the 3. And he does mention Nietzsche. That the postmodernism is also that we can basically take power ourselves, self-empowerment, and make the future what we want it to be. And if we take modernism as a belief that the progress is inexorable, and that the future is always brighter than the present, and the present is always brighter than the past, then I think postmodernism and modernism are both brands of the same thing.
Well, he, on page 13, when he talks about what shook up the modern world, not just 1 but 2 world wars, right, were the peoples of European nations, possessors of a high culture, formed in at least part by Christian faith, flung themselves on one another with a ghastly ferocity, empowered by sophisticated weaponry, as if to confirm humanity's worst suspicions about itself. Not surprisingly, bitterness and disillusionment were the first fruits of the two world wars. And I think that was a if modernity was a disenchantment with a world infused with the reality of the transcendent that we can see through signs and so on, then those wars and the waste that it turned the world into was a disenchantment with the disenchantment, right?
Yeah.
And
which I find it really bizarre, the amnesia of our own time. Because in the 1920s, there was this disenchantment with the disenchantment, which we see in the Wasteland by Eliot, for instance, and this crisis of modernity caused by the mechanized destruction of millions in World War One, and then caused by gas chambers and Gulag Archipelago, and then the dropping of the atomic bombs. Again, the Cold War, that there was this angst where basically we're all going wrong. This sort of Orwellian. George Orwell was the prophet of the fact that everything's getting worse. And here we are sort of 60, 70 years later with the collective amnesia, where we've forgotten the horrors of the 20th century. And the 21st century is all about a golden future where we, forge our way fearlessly into who we want to be.
All right, I'd like to dig into this a little deeper from my own understanding here. I think you're saying, Joseph, that the fundamental kind of philosophical view that's driving the last several centuries is this idea of unending progress. Everything is always getting better year to year. iPhone 5, iPhone 6, iPhone 7, it's always going to be better pictures and so on. So that for you, that's the fundamental principle that has gone awry. Not whether or not there's transcendence or not, or whether or not God is personal or not. That's secondary. Is that
Well, yeah, I think if it's sticking to a definition of modernism in accordance with its own criteria, then yes, the transcendental has been ditched, and I have no argument at all with either Father McTague's book or Thomas Howard's book, which has addressed that. But I think that the consequence of that dumping of the transcendental is a belief, and the only way that sustains it, I would suggest, is the belief that somehow we can make some sort of heaven on earth, some sort of golden age where we become our own God, and we will do a better job than the non-existent God did. And so I think that what we're talking about is a necessary consequence of materialism. That this idea of the future is always going to be better because there's nothing but matter, and we have to invest ourselves psychologically in this golden age because it's the only thing it's the materialistic heaven. The future is the materialistic heaven.
So it's also kind of a separation of moral goodness from technological prowess, because who can say that one age was morally superior to another, or one society more superior? Was Aristotle, less of a man than you or I, or Thomas Aquinas, or Augustine? So if you look at the soul and the spirit, there probably is no golden age either behind us or in front of us.
Right. Right.
As Chesterton says in Everlasting Man, I think it's well, do you think that society is going to get better or worse in the future? And he says, well, that's like asking whether Mr. Smith is going to get better or worse. One day he's drunken in the ditch, and the next day he's building something. But it all depends on what he decides to do.
Right, exactly. Yeah, free will. Sorry, yeah.
Vivian.
Okay, on page 15, the author talks about what this transhumanism project of the postmodern, which goes very nicely, Joseph, with what you were saying. It proposes to take command of evolution and hand in hand with science and technology, create a new race of superior beings, whom an articulate chronicler, Yuval Noah Harari, does not hesitate to call gods. In the 21st century, Harari writes, humanity will harness genetic engineering and computer science so as to acquire for us divine powers of creation and destruction. And you're right, Joseph, that's not a whole lot different from the belief in progress that we had before the world wars. And so the postmodern project just looks like the modern project on steroids.
And the irony is, of course, that this whole belief in the Nietzschean Übermensch, through the use of eugenics, genetic engineering, is exactly what the Nazis were trying to achieve, right?
Exactly. And I think he makes that point that what the Nazis tried, were just doing even more technologically. So that's the stage that he sets, and then he introduces us to these popes who, really, all of these men were prescient in whether you agree or disagree with whatever tactics they might have tried to employ to deal with this. They certainly had the vision to see what this really was, to see the threat to mankind, and to try to speak into it prophetically, to bring humanity back from the brink.
So, again, the underlying principle that for the last 2 centuries is belief in progress. Within that, would you distinguish between modernism and postmodernism in any way, Joseph?
Well, yes. I mean, it's like it's two sides of a modernist civil war. So modernist is completely optimistic about what science can achieve. Postmodernism is, in one sense, pessimistic in the sense that it argues that the reason that was the reason itself, which was the god of the empiricists, is irrational. There's no such thing as reason, but that allows them to become Nietzschean in the sense that we can still use the tools of modernity, technology, to be who we want to be. In other words, because there's no reason, it's just about desire. We can desire what we want. So there is a difference. One claims to be rational, but isn't. The other claims there's no such thing as the rational. But the point is, they both have a faith in technological progress, and they both have a reductionism where they juxtapose technological progress with human progress. They don't see the distinction between the two. In fact, it's literally putting the cart before the horse. It's putting the technological side, the inanimate, before the human.
All right. So now Russell Shaw is looking at the 20th century to see how the popes confronted this crisis of modernity, which was maybe in process of transformation from something which accepted natures or logic or wills or things in themselves to the triumph of the will, where we're simply going to create whatever we want and make our own paradise. And of course, one of the consequences of this is you reject the past. I mean, if everything's getting better, well, what good is the past?
Yep.
And
wasn't it Henry Ford who said history is bunk?
Yes, indeed. And of course, there is psychologically some very equivalent to racism here. This is the other irony in the cancel culture, is that basically the past is treated as an inferior species, that we don't have to listen to anybody that lived in the past because they are ipso facto inferior to us. So it's the same sort of attitude that racists might have to an African American. No, I don't have to listen to you because you're inferior to me, right? And so that's exactly the attitude modernity and modernism has towards the past, and it's the same arrogance, and it's the same the arrogance of ignorance is what it is in both cases.
So the first chapter is Pius X, and Russell Shaw focuses on two activities that he felt were fundamental for Pius X. One was, and they both had to do with modernism, and one had to do with the secularization of society, the exclusion of God from the public square, so to speak, as Richard Neuhaus would have put it. And the other one was the attack on orthodoxy through historical critical methods, which basically said that whatever we know about Jesus was all historically relative anyway, so we can't find any norms there for our actions. And that he, as Pope, confronted both of those with those three documents that he issued.
Yeah, and I was saying to Vivian before we went on the air, so to speak, that I feel about this book what I feel about my book Literary Converts, is that starting in 1900 was a random date, and that a book about literary converts should have started with the conversion of Newman in 1845, which was sort of definitive beginning of the Catholic revival. And talking about the popes and modernity, I think that we both sort of said that it would have been better if it started with Leo XIII, because because Rerum Novarum, if you like, sets the scene for much of the church's response to modernity in the 20th century, 1891. So he'd be extending things backwards a bit, but I think it would have been more whole approach to the topic than just starting at the random. Well, the first pope in the 20th century is Pius X, so let's start there.
All right, but Leo XIII, I think the big emphasis for him was the loss of dignity of the worker because of the machine. There's that famous passage where he says that matter goes into the factory, comes out ennobled, but man goes into the factory and comes out, more ignoble.
Yeah. I bet also a response to responses to that, such as the Marxist response. So, he condemned Marxism as well as that dehumanizing aspect of industrialism. And I think you see with the Pius XI, the Quadragesima Anno, and then St. Pius X with Centesimus Annus, that with Rerum Novarum, Leo XIII was starting a tradition of social criticism, the social doctrine of the church, that it would have been maybe good if the curtain had been raised with Leo XIII rather than Pius X. It's a minor, it's a significant criticism. It doesn't spoil the book.
Okay.
But what was interesting is that Joseph and I both had come to that conclusion independently. And so we were talking about it before as we go on the air, as he said. So that was interesting. The other thing, though, that I like about, first of all, it's a slim book and covers things that I'm familiar with, but I learned something new that I didn't know in every chapter. And one of the things that Shaw does is he has a way of seeing a silver lining in some of these things. So, for example, the secularization.
Yeah, that's a weakness.
For the pessimist, that's a weakness. But the silver lining in secularization, in the chapter on Pius X, on the bottom of 24, he says that it was a blessing in disguise for the church. For the first time in French history, indeed for the first time in any of Europe's historically Catholic countries except Ireland, the government swore off involvement in choosing bishops, leaving the Pope a free hand without interference from the state. And to tell you the truth, I didn't realize that at this late date, the regimes of Europe did have that big of a hand in choosing bishops. And also, he mentions how, on the previous page, how the conclave after Leo XIII's death,
right,
was the last one that Emperor
Franz Joseph
had a hand in choosing the Pope.
He vetoed the front runner, Rampolla. He vetoed him. Yeah.
And so I didn't know that the Austrian emperor could veto the selection of a pope at a conclave. That was news to me.
The Holy Spirit, writes straight with crooked lines, and I'm sort of reminded of the general feeling of everything's over when the church lost the papal states, in the 19th century. But it actually was a great blessing, because it allowed the church to have to speak basically with moral authority and moral integrity, and not be a worldly power in its own right. And so again, often that defeats of the church are Pyrrhic defeats. They're not really defeats at all. They're Pyrrhic victories for our enemies.
That's right.
Well, so, I mean, I think we agree that the separation of church from state, is a valuable thing. It gives the church more moral authority and less chance for a certain kind of corruption. But then when Pius X is fighting secularization, what is he fighting? Does he want to go back to Catholic monarchs, or does he see the distinction and separation of the civil and the religious orders as a good thing, but trying to avoid the absence of God in secular society?
I think what he's asking for, being very coherent in his Catholic understanding of political philosophy, is that we need all nations under God, and that any nation or any government that defies or denies the existence of God is ipso facto illegitimate. And there's only such thing as a Christian government in that sense, because without it, you don't have legitimacy.
Well, also, he was protecting the rights of the church to operate her own institutions within a secular society, because France was being very aggressive in taking over church property and closing seminaries and closing religious orders. And so, you want the Pope to stand up and defend the rights of the church, just to be herself, never mind not be.
But I think we have to distinguish between, and it's a both and, not an either or, principled objectivity and pragmatic subjectivity. In other words, yes, of course, the Pope has to look after the interests of the church in any particular nation, especially if those rights are being taken away. But in a principled sense, that all power ultimately derives from God, doesn't derive from men. And having political power that denies or defies the existence of God is illegitimate. And I think that's Catholic political philosophy, and so it should be.
Well, it's very clear that Pius X explicitly was addressing and trying to defend against modernism. Pope Benedict XV, who basically was the Pope during World War I and shortly thereafter, it's not so clear. I mean, he was the Pope of peace, trying to achieve peace, but it's not clear to me how he fits into the title theme of this book. How did Pope Benedict XV do anything with respect to the crisis of modernity?
Oh, Father, before we move on to him,
okay,
is it possible to talk about the other project of Pius X?
Oh, good.
That because this quote here from Joseph Ratzinger, I think, is very important, especially now when people are, dusting off their syllabus of errors. The other project of Pius X was to, as you pointed out in your introduction, to do something about the inroads of faithless scholarly techniques to undermine scripture, to undermine the doctrines of the church, and so on. But on page 26, Ratzinger is quoted saying, what is he saying?
Well, it starts on, let's see.
Does it start on 25? He talks about...
no, the very second line of 26.
Yeah.
Right. So such figures and their tragic schizophrenia, he's talking about the modernists there, show forth the mortal danger that threatened Catholicism at the first outbreak of the modern mind. And that quote, by the way, is where Shaw takes his chapter epilogue, first outbreak of the modern mind. They explained Pius X's uncompromising opposition to the spirit of novelty which was stirring everywhere. Ratzinger quickly adds, however, that in sifting it out, much real wheat was lost along with the chaff. I was wondering, Father, if you could explain what Ratzinger's saying here.
With respect to one aspect, I definitely can, namely a historical critical exegesis, which began to see everything in the Bible as merely human, all miracles you couldn't accept. We didn't know who Jesus was, who the writers of the Gospels were, and so on. And they took it apart from the point of view of secular historical criticism. But what he says is that there was something done there which gave us a richer view of Scripture as not a kind of a monolithic document that was written in English and translated by King James, during his reign and dropped down from heaven. But there's a historical component to understanding of Scripture. And beautifully, what Ratzinger himself did in his book, his 3-volume work on Jesus of Nazareth, in his introduction, he says, we have many benefits now from historical critical methods, but it has run its course. There's nothing else to discover in terms of because our data is so sparse that it's done good, but we can't keep beating this dead horse. Now we have to go to an interpretation of Scripture which integrates a spiritual understanding, a traditional understanding, a patristic understanding with modern exegesis. But he would say, especially as a good German, that the scholarly advances in historical criticism of literature in general, and Bible in particular, were a positive value. And therefore, to throw that out would be to lose some of the grain with the chaff. Now can we go to Benedict XV?
Great, thank you.
Well, go ahead, Joseph.
What I would say in response to what you were saying about Pope Benedict XV, where he fits into this, I was very much a pietistic convert, in the sense that not pietistic as in being pious, but as in being pious without the O. In other words, that Pius X, Pius XI, and Pius XII are great heroes of mine, and I've read a lot by them and about them on my journey to conversion. And Benedict XV was sort of overlooked, didn't seem to fit. And I must admit that lingered with me to such a degree that I puzzled as to why Ratzinger should have chosen Benedict the 16th as his name. Obviously, you have Saint Benedict, but also Pope Benedict XV. And the more I know about him, the more I greatly respect him, because, he was trying to stop that war, which was a technological debauch, which certainly there were good grounds for seeing it as a death blow to European civilization, that Europe never really recovered from it. Now, that's an oversimplification, because lots of the seeds of decadence and debauchery had already been sown, as we've discussed in various books here. But nonetheless, if you like, it was the knockout punch, perhaps, from which Europe may not recover. And the fact that Pope Benedict worked so tirelessly, first of all, to prevent that war, and then to alleviate the suffering during it, and then to oppose the Treaty of Versailles. I mean, in fact, I didn't know this, something I did learn from the book, that he wanted the papacy to be present at the negotiations for the Treaty of Versailles, would have been a voice of peace, which is exactly why the papacy was excluded, because as is always the case, the side that won the war was not interested in compromising. It wanted to basically rub the nose in it of the defeated nation. In consequence, of course, the Treaty of Versailles sowed the seeds for the rise of the Third Reich and the Second World War. So the fact that the Church, and the Pope in particular, was ignored and sidelined, sowed seeds for millions of more deaths. So this chapter taught me things about Pope Benedict I knew little about, and I'm very grateful for it.
But how does that relate to the Crisis of Modernity, which is the subtitle of this book? Or actually, it's part of the title.
I taught something last week, a class on war poetry, and the first part was War Glorified, Tennyson, Chesterton, Lepanto, and then war demonized, and how the World War I poets responded to war, because this is poison gas and tanks and aeroplanes and bombs and machine guns, and it is a whole new ball game. It's where technology is being used as weapons of mass destruction, where human beings now are completely dispensable and the machine takes over. Tolkien referred to World War II, somewhat oddly, as the first great war of the machines, because clearly the first great war of the machines was World War I. And I think that the Pope's realization that this needed to be avoided and alleviated is very much a response to modernity. It's a response to technology, and technology being used for destructive purposes.
All right, that answers my question.
I see another thing I learned here in this chapter. I'm not exactly sure how it relates to modernism, but on page 38, his vision for missionary work was really important. He saw the importance of forming a native clergy, and he also cautioned missionaries against putting their efforts at the service of imperial ambitions of their home countries. And I guess the connection to modernism and modernity is that this predates the post-colonial cancel culture that we're dealing with right now. He was ahead of his time, foreseeing that the church can't just be the arm of a colonial power. It needs to be evangelizing all to Christ. And that he spoke about that explicitly, I think showed a lot of foresight and wisdom.
Well, we've had our half hour plus. I would suggest that we consider our discussion of Benedict XV done, which means we're only one chapter behind our schedule. But it's up to you, Father. You're the boss.
No, I think that's good. And I think especially we spent a lot of time today on background, and discussing modernity and the theory of infinite progress. We don't have to do that next time. I think we'll be able to address the popes more directly. So let's do that. Let's come back, and we'll start with Pius XI, but we'll then continue with chapters 4, 5, and 6 on Pius XII, John the 23rd, and then the Second Vatican Council, which isn't a pope, but it's a lot of bishops altogether. All right. Thanks, everyone. God bless you all. See you again on the Forum Book Club.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumbookclub.ignatius.com.